If you compare images of Akhenaten other depictions of pharaohs, you'll notice that Akhenaten looks very different.
For 30 centuries, this pharaoh's real face was a locked door nobody could open. His statues survived. His temples survived. But almost everyone had been smashed, defaced, or buried on purpose, as if someone needed the world to forget his face. So historians guessed. Artists faked it. Everyone quietly agreed to stop asking. Then a team of scientists sealed themselves inside a lab in Cairo, ran a single test on his bones, and watched his true face rise back out of the dark for the first time in 3,000 years. Because this was not the king anyone expected that they would find Akhenaten behind that tomb. And they didn't. The erased face. Walk into any museum storeroom that still holds pieces of him, and the first thing that hits you is the wrongness. Curators talk about it in lowered voices. Tourists feel it before they can put a name to it. Stone faces stare out from shattered temples, and their features are unmistakable. High cheekbones, cut sharp as broken glass. Heavy-lidded eyes that droop like exhaustion. Lips drawn so wide they look stretched across the skull, and a body that blurs every line between male and female in ways no Egyptian king before him had ever permitted. When you compare some of these elongated skulls, some have sutures like we have as humans, and then there are other skulls that do not have the same sutures. These are not the carved faces of gods. They are the face of one specific human being. And every instinct you have keeps whispering that something about him is not right. The man those statues belong to was Akhenaten, and in the 13th year of his reign, he did something no pharaoh had ever dared. He shut down the temples of Ammon. Sit with that for a second. Ammon was the chief god of the entire Egyptian pantheon, the god his own father had served for a lifetime, the god whose priests had placed a crown on Akhenaten's head. And he closed their doors with a single decree. The estates of those priests were confiscated. Thousands of temple workers were dismissed. Festivals that had shaped ordinary life since before the pyramids were built were simply canceled. And he did not stop there. His own birth name, Amenhotep, was chiseled off the monuments and replaced with a new identity that honored one thing only, the disk of the sun, the A10. Then he walked away from the capital entirely. The royal court left Thebes and marched north into empty desert. And boundary markers were carved directly into the cliffs to lock the edges of a brand new city in place forever. Here is what you need to understand. This was not a king tinkering with a few rituals. This was a man tearing the spiritual spine out of the most religious civilization on earth and daring anyone alive to stop him. He would want to do that in one sweep, but he ordered all the iconography of previous gods to be removed. And think about the nerve that takes. Everyone he had ever known believed those gods were real, and he did it in the open with his own name on the order. They called the new city Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. It rose in under 2 years, its open-air temples built to catch the sun instead of hiding from it. Every wall an inscription celebrating one god and one king as that god's living voice on earth. The old gods were driven into silence. But the strangest part of that new capital was not the missing gods. It was the king's own face multiplied across every surface in shapes no Egyptian artist had ever been permitted to carve. His body rendered in proportions that violated 3,000 years of tradition. Something had changed in the man on the throne, and his own carvers were finally being allowed to record it. The only question was what? The forbidden body. A royal order preserved in fragments on limestone told Akhenaten's artists to abandon the old rules. They were instructed to carve the king as he truly appeared, not as a flawless god, not as the idealized warrior of tradition, as a man of flesh and bone. And the statues that followed are haunting in a way no other Egyptian art ever managed. Picture standing in front of one, an elongated skull that stretches backward like a teardrop, narrow shoulders that slope down as if they were too heavy to hold up, hips that flare wider than any king before him, wider than most queens, wider than anatomy alone should allow, a drooping belly hanging over the royal kilt, a soft swelling chest that no male pharaoh had ever permitted on his own likeness, let alone displayed at full scale on the walls of a public temple. Long, thin fingers, a long, thin neck, feet that look almost flat, a face that seems neither fully male nor female, but something in between that the ancient world had no words for. It is the kind of face you cannot stop staring at because some part of your brain keeps quietly insisting it is wrong. It was not only him. In the painted reliefs, the whole royal family wears it. Thin, spindly arms and legs, round, soft abdomen, faces stretched almost beyond recognition. His daughters are drawn with the exact same strange proportions, as if the bloodline carried a single physical signature passed from parent to child like an inherited mark. Nefertiti herself appears at his side, pose after pose with the same elongated skull, the same heavy jaw, the same impossibly long neck. Every wall in Aten became a gallery of this one face. Imagine being a foreign ambassador arriving at that court. You expect a normal palace and a normal king. Instead, you are walked through corridors, painted floor to ceiling with these strange, unfamiliar figures. The Aten was something that he saw in the sky between two mountains. Now the typical view is the Aten must be the sun. But it is entirely possible. Watching the most powerful man on earth choose, on purpose, to be carved like this. Several diplomats reportedly went home convinced the pharaoh had lost his mind. For centuries after, scholars argued about what any of it meant. Was it symbolic? A statement about a king who held both male and female creative forces inside him. Was it political, a clean break from tradition to mark a brand new theology? Or was it physical? Something hidden in the actual body of the man on the throne that his artists were finally free to show? For most of a century, that last possibility was the one nobody wanted to say out loud. And here is why the question mattered so much. Egyptian royal portraiture had been frozen in place for almost 2,000 years. Kings were carved as gods, and gods did not have hips, and gods did not have softness. Those rules were not about taste. They were religious law. So, breaking them was not a stylistic choice. It was a confession. The man on the throne was telling his entire kingdom something about himself that no pharaoh before him had ever been willing to admit. And his own priest would spend the next several generations trying to bury exactly what these walls were confessing. So before we go any further, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next is the thing they tried to hide under 3,000 years of desert sand. The reason a face like this could not be allowed to survive. The contradiction only got louder when his son's tomb was opened. The golden mask found in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, the mask made for Tutankhamun, shows none of these distortions. It is perfect, symmetrical, timeless. The artists who served the very next generation went straight back to the old rules the moment Akhenaten was gone. So why did they need to hide what the father had insisted on showing? The sealed lab. When the skeleton now known as KV-55 was uncovered in 1907, the tomb was so disturbed that excavators argued for years about who was actually inside. The coffin had been deliberately defaced. The cartes that named the occupant were erased. The gold face on the mask had been torn away. Someone in antiquity had wanted this body forgotten. But the bones told their own story. A skull longer than most. A jawline that matched the carved portraits, a slender, unusual frame that echoed the art. And here is the twist that fueled 100 years of feuding among physicians. The feature still sat within the range of normal human variation, which meant nobody could agree on the most basic question of all. Was the king who broke the gods truly so different from his ancestors? Or did his artist simply see something in him everyone else had missed? The theories piled up. Marfan syndrome, Fruish syndrome, gynecomastia, a rare hormonal disorder no one could quite name, a childhood head injury, a tumor pressing on his pituitary gland, or the whole strange style was pure propaganda, and the king had looked completely ordinary. Each theory rose, gained followers, made careers, and then collapsed under its own contradictions. So, the search finally moved from chisel and brush to microscope and bone. From guesswork to a sealed clean room in Cairo, where modern science was about to do what 3,000 years of argument never could. Getting there was its own battle. The project was defended for years against everyone who swore that ancient DNA could never survive the heat of an Egyptian tomb. The team spent 2 full years just designing a study airtight enough to survive every challenge coming its way. Because if they got it wrong, the skeptics would bury the entire field for another generation. 11 royal mummies were selected. Tutankhamun, whose face the world already thought it knew. For over 3,000 years, one face has stared out of the darkness at us. Gold, serene, perfect. The enigmatic individual from that defaced coffin in KV 55. An unnamed woman known only as the younger lady, hidden in a side chamber, her face deliberately smashed by someone who did not want her remembered, and 8 others spanning 3 generations, each chosen because their link to Akhenaten was either documented, suspected, or furiously denied. Every specimen moved under strict chain of custody rules. The team worked only from tooth and dense bone, the places where DNA stays locked inside like a vault. Every result was cross-checked under blind codes and confirmed independently before anyone would call it real. A single contaminated sample, one stray strand of a modern researcher's own DNA drifting onto a 30,000-year-old tooth, could have sunk the entire study and handed the doubters everything they wanted. So, the clean room was sealed tighter than an operating theater, and every extraction was run as if the world's most hostile jury were already watching. They targeted 3 kinds of genetic markers. Mitochondrial DNA passed only from mother to child, tracing the maternal line. Y chromosome markers passed only from father to son, tracing the paternal line. And a panel of autosomal fingerprints precise enough to tell parents from siblings from cousins. Likelihood ratios then weighed the odds of each possible relationship against modern Egyptian population data. And the full methods were later published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, so any expert on Earth could tear them apart if they could. Then the data came back from the sequencers. Years of work, hundreds of failed extractions, millions of base pairs, all of it narrowing down to a single file. And nothing in decades of digging in the sand had prepared anyone for what the numbers were about to say. The bloodline exposed. The final analysis left no room for doubt. The DNA of 3 mummies, KV 55, the younger lady, and Tutankhamun, fit together in a pattern seen only in the closest of families. Shared autosomal markers across multiple chromosomes. Identical mitochondrial sequences down to the last variable position. Matching Y chromosome signatures, proving a single male line. The data mapped a direct chain. KV 55 as the father, the younger lady as the mother, Tutankhamun as their biological son. So far, nothing shocking. Royal parents producing a royal heir was the entire point of the dynasty. But then they checked the parents of the parents, and that is where the floor gave way. KV 55 and the younger lady shared the same mother. They shared the same father, not half-siblings, which the dynasty had long accepted as normal. They look like they're different than other human beings. Not cousins twice removed, full biological siblings, born of the same royal mother and the same royal father who grew up together inside the same palace, married each other, and produced a son. The probability of error was vanishingly small. They rechecked the work several times before the paper ever went to press because they knew exactly how explosive it would be the moment it left the lab. For the first time in 3,000 years, the royal family tree could be drawn in unbroken lines. Every branch confirmed by molecules instead of by scribes desperate to flatter the next king on the throne. And the most famous heir of them all, the boy whose golden mask became the face of ancient Egypt itself, turned out to be the child of a brother and a sister. And here is where it all comes full circle. Once the science said the body on those walls was real, you could finally do the one thing no one had dared for 3,000 years. You could rebuild his face because the man in that coffin is now widely identified as Akhenaten himself. Take the skull from KV 55, longer than most. Set the heavy jaw the chisels kept matching. The high cheekbones cut sharp as broken glass. The heavy-lidded eyes drooping as if exhausted. The wide-stretched lips, the impossibly long neck. And let them rise back out of the stone into a single human face. Layer by layer, the man the priest had tried to delete came back into focus. Not a god's mask, not a sculptor's flattery. A real man, soft and strange, and unmistakably himself, staring back across the centuries. And here is the part that gets under your skin. A man dead for 3,000 years, and you can read his face like a stranger you passed this morning. The wide hips and the soft chest were never put on those walls for decoration. They belonged to him. The reconstructed face of Akhenaten was not a monster, and it was not a myth. It was the exact face his bones had been trying to show us the whole time. Because those feminine hips, that stretched skull, that soft drooping body the artists were finally allowed to carve, none of it was artistic license. It was not symbolism. It was not theology. The most likely explanation was biology. The recessive damage stacking up inside the royal cradle had finally broken the surface, and the king's own face was the proof, and his son would pay the rest of the bill. The dying bones. Tutankhamun's skeleton tells a story of pain that the golden mask was built to hide. High-resolution CT scans, the kind that map bone down to fractions of a millimeter, reveal a left foot twisted inward at an angle that has nothing to do with embalming. It is the classic signature of a congenital club foot. The bones rotated and shortened. The heel pulled up, the toes turned in. A normal walking gait would have been physically impossible from the first day he tried to stand. This was a king the world still pictures racing a war chariot, and the evidence says he could not have crossed his own throne room without help. On the right side, a small bone at the tip of one toe is missing entirely. Not broken, not eroded by time, absent from birth. The kind of congenital absence doctors today still see in children whose parents share too much DNA. The joints of the midfoot show early collapse and signs of a vascular necrosis, the silent death of bone tissue when the blood supply fails. By the time he reached his teens, the bones inside his sandals were already dying. His spine curves forward in the middle of the back, a mild bend that threw off his balance and forced him to compensate with every step. And the roof of his mouth carried a cleft, a gap that was never repaired by physicians who had no tools to even try. The tomb of King Amu-III was discovered in 1799, and then it was rediscovered again in 1915 by Howard Carter. That alone would have strained his speech, made eating without choking dangerous, and left a constant background risk of infection. Now here is the detail that makes all of it real. Inside his tomb, archaeologists found more than 130 walking sticks. Some plain wood, some inlaid with gold and electrum, some carved with images of his enemies trampled underfoot so that every step ground his foes into the dust, and many of them were worn smooth at the handle, in the exact pattern of a young man's grip, pressed down hard for support. Picture him reaching for one in the morning. A boy, not yet 20, alone in the half-light before his attendants arrive. He swings his good leg over the edge of the bed. His fingers close around the worn handle of a stick he has kneaded since he could walk. The wood is warm where his hand has lived for years. The weight of his own body settles into his palm, and only then does he stand. No one in the corridor will see him take that first step. No one in the kingdom will ever be told he needs the stick at all. The painters outside will keep drawing him on chariots, hunting lions, leading armies. The stick will never appear in any of it. These were not symbols of pharaonic authority. They were tools. He needed them to cross a room. He needed them to stand at his own coronation. He needed them almost every single day of his short adult life. Then DNA from his body revealed something the bones alone never could. Traces of the parasite behind the deadliest form of malaria, Plasmodium falciparum. And not just one strain. Signs of repeated infection, tearing through an immune system already too weakened by inherited illness to fight back the way a healthy teenager should. Because that is how old he was. Tutankhamun died at roughly 19. His body, a catalog of inherited and acquired disease, a club foot that crippled him, a spine that bent him, a palate that split his mouth, bones dying while he was still alive, and finally a tropical fever, finishing what his own blood had started. But none of this was bad luck. So, how does a single family keep producing children this broken generation after generation? The priests knew the answer. They just never wrote it down. The fatal policy. The reason the boy in the gold mask could barely walk reaches all the way back through his father, through his grandfather, through nearly every royal marriage buried in the heart of the 18th dynasty. To understand why his bones broke, you have to understand the one rule his family refused to bend. Royal Egypt did not stumble into these marriages by accident. Sibling marriage was deliberate policy rooted in a belief that the king's blood carried an actual physical spark of the divine. Hymns and boundary stones describe the royal line as a living conduit for cosmic order, the only thing standing between civilization and the chaos waiting to swallow it. So the pharaoh's sister was not just a wife. She was seen as a vessel for the same sacred inheritance, the only womb pure enough to be trusted with the throne. The logic was chillingly simple. The legitimate heir had to be born as close to the divine line as possible, so power never strayed beyond the family circle. Half-sibling unions had been common for generations. Full-sibling marriages were rarer.